All right, go for it.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It's V, the Grill Economist, and we have with us Harley Schlanger. Harley's here, and he needs no introduction. You can find his work over at LaRouchePack.com as well as the SchillerInstitute.org. And with that being said, Harley, there is so much to talk about. Where do we begin?
Every morning when I get up to prepare my update, I find that it's taking longer and longer to sift through the incredible amounts of psychological warfare.
Yep.
And I've begun to realize that the way you find the truth is you sift through the psychological warfare.
Yeah.
And see what's going on. I mean, there are a number of examples of that, but I think one of the best places to start is what happened in the Senate Intelligence Committee this week, because it showed two things. One is that the counter coup is still alive,
Right.
but people like Lindsey Graham are going to let their stupidity kill it if we don't keep them focused. I mean, what came out with the Rosenstein hearing was quite laughable. He almost did a Robert Mueller impersonation. As he said, he didn't remember certain things. He claimed he never read the FISA warrant, the fourth warrant, the one that he signed for Carter Page,
Yeah.
before he signed it. Now, how does a deputy attorney general not read something that goes before a secret court authorizing surveillance against a president? It's really quite astounding if that's true.
Correct.
Secondly, he had this little pissing contest with Andrew McCabe. And this is a beautiful example of what will happen if the pressure is put on these guys, on the perpetrators.
Right.
What happened is he basically said McCabe kept him in the dark, didn't really brief him. And within an hour, McCabe was out with his own statement saying Rosenstein is lying.
I love it. They're eating each other.
No, McCabe is lying.
Right.
So, this is interesting because these guys are going to turn on each other very quickly.
Hmm.
Then the last point from his testimony was when he said that he never drafted the scope memo. In other words, the memo that defined what Mueller was supposed to look for. That was supposed to be his job as the person overseeing the special counsel's activity. And instead, he let Mueller write it. Now, what Mueller wrote was essentially a printout from the Christopher Steele report.
Yeah.
Rosenstein and the FBI had already decided by that time in the spring and summer of 2017 that the Christopher Steele dossier was complete crap. So how did they let Mueller get away with making that the basis of his investigation? Now, what I found astounding, besides that this is just more proof that the whole Russiagate was a fraud from the beginning, is how Lindsey Graham played it. And this is the biggest problem we're going to face. Unless you get, if you really want to get at the origins of Russiagate, you have to know what was the intent of people doing it. And you're not going to find that out from Rosenstein because he didn't really do it. He was just a cog in the wheel. Even in that sense, Mueller turns out to be just a hitman that was being deployed. But Lindsey Graham gave credibility to the lie that the Russians were meddling. And as long as that lie is left untouched, you never get to the root of the story, because you can always say, well, since we knew the Russians were involved, we had to investigate. Well, why didn't we investigate whether the Russians were really involved? Well, because the intelligence community, the so-called deep state, wouldn't do that. They tasked that job over to CrowdStrike, which is part of the deep state.
Right.
They admitted, the president of CrowdStrike admitted that they never had any evidence of emails being exfiltrated, in other words, taken from the files by the Russians or anyone. So this proves the point. There was no Russian meddling. Now, Lindsey Graham, by not calling that out, is protecting the actual network that the Brennans and the Clappers and the Comeys and the Andrew McCabe worked for.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just Obama. Obama didn't run this thing. Obama was just another cog in it. It was run by the highest levels of British intelligence, the City of London, and they're operatives from Wall Street and the military-industrial complex. Now, what this means is that despite the good work that's been done by some of the intelligence staffers, the Senate Intelligence Committee, if they stick to Graham's fraudulent formulation, we're not going to get the full story. And we need that full story because it's the same British network that's involved in the riots in the cities in the United States and that are trying to use this as the next phase of the coup against President Trump.
Yeah. I mean, the pandemic is fizzled out. The social distancing has failed miserably in over 100 some odd cities, where you see these rioters with no face masks, elbow to elbow. And it's remarkable to see this, Harley, to say the least, because no one's even talking about coronavirus anymore. It's completely disappeared.
Well, and I'll tell you, here's where you see the interesting question coming up. The attempt to shift the coronavirus story to a war footing with China.
Yeah.
And there's a very fascinating story that came up on the Daily Telegraph yesterday. They've started a new podcast, and their second guest was Sir Richard Dearloffe, the former head of MI6. And Dearloffe was practically hyperventilating, talking about this new study, which proves that the coronavirus was man-made in a lab in Wuhan. And you don't know exactly how it escaped, but what it means is that the Chinese unleashed it, and every country has to demand reparations from China. So what's the study that he was referring to? It was done by a British scientist, which means someone out of MI6, and the chief scientist of the Norwegian military, who has now distanced himself from this report. He went on to say that he wants his name removed from it because Nature magazine and the Journal of Virology said the research is unsuitable for publication. Yeah. Now, where have we seen this before? Sir Richard Dearloffe presenting crap as so-called intelligence. Well, he's the one who gave the weapons of mass destruction of Iraq dossier to Colin Powell, and probably provided the satellite photos of the taco truck in the Iraqi desert, which Powell said was a chemical weapons warfare lab. And he also vouched for Christopher Steele, who did the Steele dossier.
Yeah.
Now, Dearloffe surfacing on the China issue is very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And V, there's a second story out of London from today. The Royal Institute of International Affairs, which is also known as Chatham House,
right,
which is the central think tank of British intelligence, they have something called the Queen Elizabeth II Academy for Leadership in International Affairs. And the director of this posted something yesterday or 2 days ago titled, "Presidential Tactics Pose Grave Leadership Threats to America's Democracy."
Huh.
And it basically is an attack on Trump. And it says that race and pandemic issues will determine the US election. These issues will sink Trump. It says the economy is another factor, but primarily Trump will be defeated because of his racism.
This
is what you call the wet dream of British intelligence.
Of course. No, exactly. The Steele dossier fizzled out. That's being known as fraud. And Harley, what's your take on what's going on? I mean, I think there's hell to pay, and I think it's coming. Recently, Barr, put out there that they have the text messages from key politicians and elites and celebrities with their continued communications with top level members of Antifa and how they were funding it, how they were bailing people out, this, that, and the other, and that he's threatening that there's a threat to release this.
Well, they should. I mean,
I don't know
if you heard this, but apparently the FBI has come out with its report saying there's no evidence of Antifa involvement in the violence. So that probably proves that there is evidence.
Exactly.
They're just covering it up. Now, here's the important thing to realize. Antifa began as part of a global network It was funded by people like George Soros, the Ford Foundation, and other typical regime change operations with the intention of having a global network that would provoke unrest and that would convince people, this is in their own documents, convince people that society is breaking down to make them more frightened and easy to control.
Yep.
So, what is their belief? What are they fighting for? The idea that they're anti-fascist when they're using the methods of the SA of Hitler is, almost a sad joke. But where are the reports coming from that Antifa is involved in this? They're coming from local police who do keep tabs on these things. In the United States, there was a training camp in Portland, Oregon, that was set up just outside of Portland. That was involved in some of the riots and confrontations in Oregon between the so-called militant right and the militant left.
Right.
And just as in Nazi Germany, when people went back and forth between the stormtroopers and the Communist Party thugs, you see the same thing. The same people one day are marching under the black uniforms and covering of their heads with Antifa and the Black Bloc. The next day they're marching as armed members of the militant right. So this is another intelligence operation, and it's part of the coup attempt against Trump. Now, I think Trump made a little bit of a mistake here. He probably should have talked to the military first before asserting that he was going to send them into the streets under the Insurrection Act. And I have a couple of interesting things on that in a moment. But even so, I was told is that top military people said, we don't need the military in there. Use the local police and the National Guard. If necessary, we're there.
Right.
Now, the important thing is the media went nuts. Here's Trump, the dictator, talking about deploying the U.S. Army in the streets, as if that's never happened before. Let me give you 3 examples. Dwight Eisenhower in 1957 used the Insurrection Act to send U.S. military into Little Rock, Arkansas to desegregate the schools. 1968, after the assassination of Martin Luther King, Lyndon Johnson used the Insurrection Act to send troops into the streets to stop the rioting after the King assassination. And this was largely as a result of the riots in Watts and in Detroit in 64, 65, where there were, I think, as many as 100 people who were killed. In 1992, George H.W. Bush deployed the Insurrection Act to have troops in Los Angeles on standby after the Rodney King verdict, in which the 4 officers who beat him were acquitted.
Right.
Now, did Jim Mattis mention that when he said Trump made a mockery of the Constitution? Did any of the media mention these other presidents using it? No, it's the authoritarian fascist Donald Trump. And that's why Antifa has to mobilize to protect us from the fascism in the White House.
Oh, yeah.
So this is the fraudulent story that's part 3 or part 4 of the coup against Trump. I guess it's part 4 because the coronavirus was part 3.
I've lost count at this point. I think next week this rioting and stuff will subside. It will all go away, and I truly believe that next week it's going to be the alien invasion, and that's going to be the thing. I mean, Project Bluebeam is set to activate at any moment, Harley.
Well, nothing would surprise me at this point. You do have the desperation to prevent the counter coup from breaking into the open. And one of the operations that's being deployed is something called the Lincoln Project. I don't know if you heard about this. This is the attempt to reconstitute the never-Trumpers among the Republican so-called mainstream that were deployed against Trump in the 2016 period leading up to the Republican convention. It's headed up by 2 McCain operatives. But one of the most prominent people they have in it is George Conway, the husband of Kellyanne Conway.
Oh, that guy.
He seems to, as they say in Louisiana, his elevator don't go all the way to the top.
No.
He's out there trying to run a Republican operation against Trump when Trump is still registering something like 97% approval with Republicans.
Correct.
So, all of this is occurring as we're seeing when you say the coronavirus problem is behind us, there's one aspect to it that isn't behind us, which is we're going to have a tidal wave of defaults and bankruptcies this summer.
Yep.
As a result of the lockdown. Let me see if I can find these statistics for you. This is amazing. TransUnion, which is a credit bureau,
Correct.
reports that there are 3 million auto loans and 15 million credit card accounts
In
that
default.
are covered for the moment in this program that allows you to skip payments or make partial payments. That was part of the CARES Act. They didn't give you money for it. They just allow you to skip payments or make partial payments. That's going to end sometime at the end of this month.
Right.
What happens then? 15 million credit card accounts are going to blow out.
Yep.
There are 4.75 million homeowners. That's 9% of all mortgages that are in forbearance plans that are also part of the CARES Act, which will soon run out. Then you add to that the 40 to 50 million jobless, who have, I think about 42.5 million have filed claims since mid-March. They're going to run out of their $600 a month extra money. What's going to happen with them if the jobs don't open up? Now, there's an answer to that. Don't go back to the same old economy, which was a fraudulent mixture of speculation, casino economy, and low-wage service jobs. We need a massive investment of money in infrastructure. And one of the proposals that I find quite interesting is there's a bill before Congress for a national infrastructure bank, which I think in the description of the legislation even calls it a Hamiltonian credit institution. So there are solutions to these problems. Now, the other area to look at for solutions is Trump talking to Putin. Now, Trump made this proposal for a new G7 to include South Korea, Japan, or not Japan, South Korea, I guess India and Russia. And he talked to Putin about it. Now, Putin said, look, the G7 is pretty much dead, and we need to expand it. But you can't do it without China. Whether you like China or not, it's the second largest economy in the world. And secondly, so much of the U.S. economy is still tied to China.
Correct.
That even while you need a move to protect the supply chains and rebuild American industry, you're not going to be able to do it overnight. And so you have one faction in the White House that's talking about constructive engagement still. This is people like Mnuchin and Lighthizer. Lighthizer made an interesting statement today about how pleasantly surprised he's been that the Chinese have stuck with phase one of the trade agreement in spite of everything. And he said that we're moving very rapidly toward a phase two agreement, which will shock everyone with the benefits that it will give the United States.
Yeah.
And they've got full support from Trump on that. So while Pompeo is doing his Mad Hatter routine, running around the world talking about Chinese Communist Party being the enemy of everyone, you've got people around Trump saying, well, you can pay lip service to that, but the reality is we need China.
Correct.
Then
what
you
have
have
done to rein Pompeo in? I mean, the guy is just literally running around thinking he's president, like what CJ would say.
Yeah. Well, then you've got the Pentagon, which some people think is moving toward war with China. But if you actually talk to military intelligence people, what they say is a containment policy won't work. This isn't 1947. We don't need George Kennan and the X paper. What we need instead is some form of enhanced deterrence, but something short of a military confrontation, because they know a military confrontation with China will not end well, given the problem with the Pacific Ocean, the status of U.S. forces right now, and you don't want to be in a war which is going to end up rapidly moving toward nuclear. So the military is saying, look, we'll show a little muscle here. We'll send a ship into the Taiwan Straits, maybe a couple into the South China Sea. But at the same time, let's talk to China. Now, this is where the Trump-Putin relationship becomes so important, because Putin on this is going to tell Trump, and he may have already said this. We don't know much of what was said when they talked the other day, which is fine. But what Zakharova, the foreign policy spokesman for the Kremlin, said is that the view of Putin is that the United States and China can work together. We can reach agreements, and that these are necessary for the future of humanity. And given that Trump finished the discussion with Putin saying, let's do this again soon, and then immediately afterwards, Milley, the head of the Joint Chiefs, spoke with Shoigu, Esper rather, who's the defense secretary, spoke with Shoigu, the Russian minister of defense.
Right.
There's obviously a lot of discussion going on. Now, one final thing that I think your listeners will get a big kick out of. You may remember I reported a few weeks ago that the German Constitutional Court ruled that the bailout policies of the European Union are against the German basic law. And therefore, they instructed the German Bundestag, the parliament, and the German central bank to stop purchasing European Union bonds until this is addressed. Now, this is an existential threat for the European Union because the German banks and the German government are one of the two or three largest, well, they are the largest, but among the largest contributors to the fraud known as the euro. If you cut off German purchases of EU bonds and European Central Bank bonds, the money going into the EU slows to a trickle. So initially, the European Central Bank said, well, let's work out an agreement. There was a meeting between Merkel and Macron to come up with some kind of new banking system that would work. All they came up with was a 750 billion euro bailout, which is not even a bailout. It's a loan that's going to have to be paid back with interest by countries that can't afford right now to pay interest alone. He can't even pay the interest. So the Germans said, no, this isn't the solution. So yesterday, the European Central Bank basically declared war on the German Constitutional Court.
Yeah.
Now, this is really interesting because you have, for the first time in my experience, a German institution standing up for the sovereign rights of the nation of Germany. And if the rest of the Europeans are watching this very closely, some of them are saying things like, well, this is not a good idea. Germany's only protecting itself. But privately, they're saying, thank God someone's standing up against the bureaucrats.
Of course.
And final note on this, you'll appreciate this because you've had a chance to talk with Marco Zanni. The EU came out and said, what Trump is doing with calling on the military is unacceptable from a European standpoint because European nations would never deploy militant force against demonstrators. And Marco Zanni said, yeah, of course not. Just tell that to the yellow vests in France.
Exactly. I mean, these people are insane. They're just living in a cloud. They're so far removed from reality and from the average person on the street.
Well, the hypocrisy is coming out in the open.
It truly is. I think all of this. I mean, if anything, these riots have shown is the absolute failure of these far left progressives in these stronghold cities where there's so much lying and looting and cheating and stealing and corruption from the foundation to the topmost stone. I mean, why is this happening in large Democrat-controlled cities? Number one. Number two, why and how are these pallets of bricks coming out of nowhere? And who's doing it? I mean, there's such a corruption.
Here's the other point then. Now that you have the piles of bricks, let's start building new roads, new bridges, new dams. The problem you have is that you have the so-called progressives who spend money on things that do nothing to improve the economy. But then you have the austerity mongering Republicans who say the solution, therefore, is not spend money on anything. And as a result, we have a collapsed infrastructure. Now, that's why the National Infrastructure Bank proposal is interesting. Trump called for phase 4 to be $3 trillion in infrastructure. What I would say is, why don't you cancel the $4 trillion in bailouts to Wall Street and use that money for infrastructure? That would be a way to not just start up the economy and create jobs, but actually jobs in the front end technologies that will define the future. So there are solutions here,
Yeah.
and many of them are things President Trump has discussed, although a big part of the intention of the operation against him is to have him fighting so many fires at once that he can't see clear to the next week or next month, much less the next 24 hours.
Right. Absolutely right. It's all about K Bono, and it's all about follow the money. Speaking of follow the money, honey, money here, Harley, I have right here GovTrades. I don't know who put this up, but we're trying to reach out to the creators over here. This is brilliant. You type into this website, govtrades.com. Watch this. Okay. Charles Schumer. You can tell exactly now all the stocks they've owned and what are their portfolio returns. There it is. I don't know who did this. Wait till it loads. I think.
Well, you know who's going to be very upset about this is Dianne Feinstein and Nancy Pelosi and people like that. Is Pelosi on there?
Not yet. They just have the senators. And before it actually showed the total amount of stocks. Like here's Richard Burr. Right? Here it is. There we go.
Yeah.
See, here's their holdings. There it is. Look at Pocahontas over here. Where is she? Elizabeth Warren, 7.9 million in Trigex. It's TIA growth and income retirement fund, and you see all the returns right here. Just type in their name, govtrades.com, and you'll see what these guys are investing in. Oh my God! You
also see why it's impossible to get them to take seriously the problems that the average person is facing.
Correct.
You know, look at the actual shift in employment away from goods production into services, and we're told, look, the service economy is the future. With artificial intelligence and so on, there are going to be fewer and fewer jobs producing things. Well, how are you going to have a society if there's no production?
Right.
This is one of the biggest frauds, the idea that structural unemployment is the result of progress. Well, if that's the case, then the Luddites were right. They should have destroyed the spinning wheels back in the 18th century. Instead, we created a whole new industry, the textile industry.
Yep.
You know, every time you have an advance in technology, it has a spillover effect into many other areas. Same thing with the space program. Same thing with energy production. So, you know, the argument that we're going to have to get used to structural unemployment and therefore go to basic income is one of these frauds that essentially denies the idea of human creativity as the driver of an economy.
Sure. Exactly correct. Very well said. Harley, thank you so much for joining us and sharing this valuable information with us. Surely we are in the maelstrom of this entire global epoch being played out before us, and it is going to be truly riveting, exciting, and terrifying all at the same time.
And I have an article I just sent to the publication today on how the riots are part of the escalation of the coup against Trump. If anyone wants to see that article, just send me a note at harleysch@gmail.com and I'll send it off to you. So it's harleysch@gmail.com and I'll send you the article.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And with that being said, folks, this is V, CJ, and with Harley. Have a great weekend. Enjoy.